Lawrence, this is the Global Digest think tank group. What was your background?
I started off working in tech, um, but working in the legal side of things in the UK and looking into exporting into Indonesia because we were dealing at that time with the Indonesian with the government exporting to there. So I first started looking into kind of the intricacies of UK Indonesian trade and legalities at that point in the early point in my career. Um, then sort of stayed with that for a time and always had this interest in Southeast Asia and the area. And yeah, focused on that during my master's degree. I looked a lot into the Global Magnitsky Act and the Sanctions Anti-Money Laundering Act from the UK. So from the US and the UK perspectives on these two pieces of legislation, but focused on the impact on Southeast Asia during that time. That was for my master's. And then after that, I got offered a role to work with the European Commission in the Philippines, in Manila. So I looked a lot at that time on kind of EU Philippines trade and cooperation. And that was really when I got my true kind of opportunity to get a real in-depth experience of working in the region in an international setting. And that was really great. And then from there, went to work on with a geopolitical consultancy, working on, well, then mainly based around security. And at that time, I was looking into kind of security upon trade routes and things like that for several clients between Europe and Southeast Asia. And yeah, I've had this affiliation with a think tank in Bangkok for looking at Southeast Asian, ASEAN, and German relations. They're covering a variety of items there. During that time, worked on items out of Singapore and the Philippines, and now I will just be starting a new research venture looking into, on the one hand, sort of energy FDI between sort of China, Indonesia, and also with other countries like Japan and Korea, for one thing, and then also working on an assessment of semiconductor policy throughout ASEAN nations to get a better insight.
So it seems you are living around South Asian country, Bangkok, Philippines, Singapore.
I have various connections to the Philippines. I have quite a network here from my time with the Commission and also working with a number of NGOs in the Philippines. So it's become a natural base for me within the region, and my work here has mostly allowed me to either work remote or work between the Philippines and Europe and Southeast Asia and Europe. Um, so yeah, the Philippines is interesting for me, and especially now I find it very interesting because of the state of energy within the Philippines and energy exports, nickel and so on. I think it's a quite an interesting time to be here due to the American affiliation with the region and with the Philippines specifically. I find, Singapore, Malaysia, interesting places due to they are very critical within the kind of the Straits of Malacca, and this provides an interesting perspective and also culturally from their own perspectives, bringing their own flavor. And also that British influence is quite interesting from a legal perspective, as a legal scholar myself, to understand the region a bit more.
You can say it's similar legal system between British and Singapore, Malaysia.
I think, yeah, with some notable exceptions, but overall the legal codes are quite it's good for me to understand those regions because of my background.
What about
So
Thailand? It's totally different legal system, or how do you see that?
yeah, Thailand for me it's an amalgamation of a lot of different legal systems. Um, and it also has its approach to legality from the monarch's perspective, from the legal status of the monarch, which makes it a very curious legal system overall. So it's not as straightforward of an understanding for me, having not covered so much of that. But it presents a unique and interesting challenge to approach Thailand more in the future, to understand that more at a time when the world will take me there, when my work will take me there to be officially, in Thailand. It will be interesting to look into it more.
Right. Maybe language, maybe a little bit difficult communication because ordinary people you may not be able to speak in English. So that's different from Philippines. Currently the situation is very tension in Europe also, because of the war in Europe and also in Philippines. Also recently there was a skirmish between uh, Chinese Navy and Philippine uh, Coast Guard. Is any effect on trading or international business in your opinion?
So, in the area that I'm looking into overall, I don't consider the Philippine and Chinese naval coast guard clashes around the Spratlys and the South China Sea to have the greatest overall impact on a global trade account. It definitely presents some hurdles towards Chinese and Filipino cooperation within trade, but I think they are able to compartmentalize to an extent this issue of the South China Sea and FDI in other areas because I think the strategic and the vital importance of accessing, let's say, the minerals in the Philippines is a pressing enough matter. So they do have some crossover, but they are able to find a workaround in the end.
Yes, I mean you are working for EU, ASEAN, China. Uh, I don't know. European Union now they are working trading or any business more with ASEAN region. ASEAN, European can be one side. So I don't know how European Union position or current status. They are working more with ASEAN.
So I think the emphasis between the EU on China, there's definitely more emphasis on trying to facilitate the trade between the two blocks there. But I think from my own perspective, the EU is really missing a trick when it comes to its engagement with nations of ASEAN. I think the EU has come to the table. For example, if we look at the Philippines, the EU and the Philippines were negotiating a free trade agreement, which then got paused under the Duterte regime. Um, and was due to the European Union's concerns about the respect for human rights and press freedoms and such, and this not be applicable and the EU's free trade agreement conditionalities. So this was a problem for the EU at the time. As of last year, upon Ursula von der Leyen's visit to the Philippines, they have decided to open negotiations again, um, to discuss the free trade agreement and to move on from the general stream of preferences, which is currently being the trade regime between the EU and the Philippines. But this presents to me a very interesting and unique question in the sense of the EU, as a global player, will always have its
Right,
conditionality or has had a very keen interest on promoting its conditionalities for a very long time. Um, but in this era of changed global dynamics, especially within trade, to what extent does the EU perhaps have to approach the situation with more flexibility, and to what extent does the EU have to look more at the application of the conditionalities that it sets out itself, but really appreciate the ASEAN nations' perspective on the EU's own conditionalities? Because at the end of the day, the EU needs more partnerships within the region. This is for sure something they need to do. And building partnerships within the ASEAN nation states it's a very strategic and a sound move overall. So it will be interesting to see how the EU cooperates with ASEAN member states in the near future. I think there will be a very interesting change in dynamics from how things have been in the past.
right. I see. Usually, traditionally, EU scene, they are heavily trading with China.
Yeah.
Even like many Europeans still doing business when Ukraine Russia war started. Like as consequent, Nord Stream was blown out because I mean there are evidence Europeans are willing to do business in any circumstances, even next to the door was in the war. Uh, and also I saw many other European countries, not just Germany, also Italy. Also, I think most Europeans are heavily depend on trading with China, right? A lot of
Mm.
Chinese good uh, convenience and cheaper, many reasons. They are doing trading more. Can you say the EU policy on trading is behind geopolitical policy?
It's a difficult clash between practicality and idealism overall. But I think the EU does need to come to terms with the fact that it needs to build a stronger relationship with China on its own terms. I think is very important because in this globally shifting world regarding international trade, the US is no longer entirely able to meet the demands of, let's say, of the EU as a strategic and valued and reliable partner. So the EU needs to diversify. It needs to go into China, into that situation, understanding the true nature of what China offers and also China's limitations. Um, and overall, I reiterate the fact that I think it needs to engage further with ASEAN nations with more urgency. This is how I see the situation.
European Commission and European Union, as you are working in European Commission, and how do you see European Commission role as the whole union representative policy, or it's more about individual country, they make their own policy?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question in terms of what goes out of the EU and what comes into the EU in terms of trade.
Right,
Certain things are essentially you have certain countries which are ahead in terms of their policy. They're much more advanced than other countries.
right,
For example, if we look at um, the Netherlands in regards to, I don't know, let's look at Dutch ports, right? The Dutch port policy is quite progressive compared to, for example, port policy in Bulgaria. There's a disconnect overall, which makes it problematic to align across the board and harmonize EU policy on ingoing and outgoing trade overall. Um, so standardization is the most pressing matter for EU trade in areas like that. There is more alignment when it comes to, let's say, the EU external action in foreign policy. Overall, they have the mandate to come to a more aligned conclusion on negotiating free trade agreements and aspects like that. But I think there's always more work to be done on a harmonization across EU member states for more coherent policy overall in the long term. Philippines to EU is commodities based. There are agricultural products going out. Also, the Philippines is growing in a sense of its semiconductor capacity and electronics capacity as a player within the region overall. And also in terms of human capital, the Philippines has always been known as a nation with its big exports being overseas foreign workers, Philippine nationals going over the seas, especially within the healthcare sector. So I think, although this is an interesting perspective and topic in itself, considering how the EU is changing its policies on immigration overall, I know it's become more difficult to send Filipino medical workers to Germany, for example. And overall, in theory, there should be more alignment with the EU across countries on migration policy. But the fact of the matter is there is not the greatest deal of alignment there. With a lot of countries or even states within countries themselves. Like within Germany, you have different states with different migration quotas and different approaches to the system, which can be, for the region, it can be an advantage, I have to say. But for overall cohesion of the EU, it does not align with how things perhaps could be to streamline the requirements of the union overall. But it's always a question of balancing the nation between the union overall.
Which means time to time is changing, right? It's changing policy, it's changing the condition. As you said, Philippines is a lot of human resource and migrant exporter, and, and not just labor, also for marriage with the European, most they maybe older person, I guess.
That presents an interesting social angle to the overall economics of the situation.
Not not formally nursing or medical sector, but marriage to the old guy, which means uh, it's required to take care of the old guy, you know. It's a kind of nurturing,
Mhm.
but it's go under marriage program. But marriage program is not a health program. That is a social program.
So
So they are mixing, right? Social program under marriage program, but when they went there, the marriage with the older person, and which means they are doing healthcare, a kind of nurturing their husband. It's a kind of like that. How do you see that?
I suppose the question of this would be an interesting gray zone in terms of the marriage compared to the premise of healthcare or carers overall. It's it presents an interesting perspective. I know that overall it's quite difficult for Dutch nationals to bring in, if they have foreign partners, it's not a simple process. It's a very complex process and requires a lot of proof and a lot of actually quite interestingly enough, the linguistic exams and the requirements from the Dutch government for the integration, including language, I think have recently gone up from something like A2 to B1 requirement or will be. And this presents a really interesting perspective on the flow of of migration between the countries. Because Dutch is by, there are some linguistic similarities with English in some aspects, but it's not an easy language for a lot of people to grasp in the beginning to achieve these levels. And there are a
Uh,
lot of administrative loopholes to jump through to bring your spouse or partner over. But it's at the end of the day, if it's presenting an opportunity for companionship and it's genuine relationship between Filipinos and Dutch citizens, I'm sure they find a way, and I'm very happy for them to find that way.
so you mean the policy is once they get officially married, if they have marriage certificate, right away they are not issue a visa in European country in case of Dutch government. What about in Denmark or Norway or other country? It's country a different policy.
Yes, each country in this regards to the migration, to this area of migration into the country, is very much dependent on the specific legislation of the specific country. The Netherlands or Denmark, for example, have very strong high criteria, whereas, let's say, you're a Spanish citizen or a permanent resident or an EU citizen living in Spain and you want to bring over your partner from the Philippines, this will be greatly expedited from the Spanish government's perspective because of the Spanish colonial links with the Philippines. The Spanish government, it has a quite progressive policy towards migration from former colonies of the Spanish Empire.
Really?
So for Filipinos, they can be, I think, resident in Spain for 2 years, and then they can be eligible to start the application process um, to become a Spanish citizen. There are still linguistic requirements and whatnot, but if you look at a language like Tagalog, which is one of the bigger languages in the Philippines, or Chevocano, there are more links with Spanish language. So Filipinos, it's an achievable goal for a Filipino to learn Spanish, I believe.
See, I
So it's
did not know
good proof.
that you said Spain has policy. They restricted more heavily restricted the former colonized country to immigrant into the Spain. It's same apply in British. I don't know. Do you have idea?
The British system has a more streamlined process for nationals of former countries of colonies and also now the Commonwealth in comparison to a regular migrant. Let's say, for example, the UK and Australia, they have a shared work visa policy overall. So there's an understanding and agreement between the UK, which allows young people from Australia to come to the UK or vice versa to work for up to 1 year, but also with extendable options for up to, I think, 2 years, depending on certain types of required work. I know, for example, it would be in, I think there's a demand for farming on both visa sides. So if you undertake a certain amount of farming in the UK or Australia, you have the eligibility to apply for the second year of the work visa. And then from there, if you fit the quota of in-demand jobs, then you will have an easier time of transitioning from a working holiday visa into a work visa, and then so on and so forth. If you look at a country like Pakistan and the UK, it's still in this sort of Commonwealth alignment situation, but the individual agreements differ, and it's not so straightforward overall.
See, I see. I don't know overall EU policy related to the marriage immigrant. You can say it's a marriage immigrant. It's, I mean, human right law after any marriage, after they become couple, family, it is strongly prohibited for any separation of family, right? In any uh, government, any law. How about EU overall policy?
There is an overarching policy which applies in certain situations. Let's say, the EU has its freedom of movement, which, for example, will allow an Italian citizen to live and work in the Netherlands without difficulty. Um, and this makes for an interesting EU policy overall because the EU has a standardized policy for, let's say, bringing in your spouse or your partner. Um, if you are an EU citizen living outside of your nation to which your citizenship is affiliated with, so an Italian living in the Netherlands, EU rule will apply to your case. So it's a much more effective and streamlined process for EU ruling on this policy for you to bring in your non-EU spouse or partner. But if you are an Italian trying to do it in Italy, you will have to align with Italian national policy in this regard.
Let's see, let's see. That is uh, human resource or research, human resource exporting or trading. Maybe you also know human right law, probably, I guess.
Yeah, I've engaged with it plenty during the duration of my career.
Right. Maybe I think most marriage visa will be happen in Philippines and then Thailand. I think these are mostly famous in such kind of human resource. Also, maybe probably Vietnam, right? With European, I think European Union they have more Filipino than Thailand or Vietnam, right?
I think more Filipinos overall. I can't quote for you specific figures, but I know certain countries within the EU have a predominant population of Southeast Asian people. For example, Malta or Ireland, as EU members, have a greater number of Filipinos. But there is the connection between East Germany and Vietnam, or, well, sorry, former East Germany, now Germany, and also the Czech Republic in Vietnam. So you will find Vietnamese diaspora in Czech Republic and in the east of Germany, which carries on into this day and in some level of cooperation overall. And it's quite an interesting take on how Southeast Asian populations have become present within European society. And you also have populations of Filipinos in Spain, for example, due to
Right.
the ease of obtaining a visa for Filipinos in Spain.
Right. Okay, Lawrence, thank you for today.